Have you ever been in a conversation, maybe at work, maybe online, and someone says something that sounds perfectly, you know, kind and moral, not an insult? Something like, a kind person wouldn't do that, or you must not be mature enough to think that way.
And there's that pause.
Yes, that specific 2-second silence that follows. And you don't feel anger, you feel this deep internal recoil. It's shame.
It's so disorienting because it completely bypasses your logic. It's not a critique of your facts, is it?
Not at all.
It's an attack on your standing. This is that subtle injury we're looking at today, what some call moral bullying. It doesn't question what you said.
No, it questions your fundamental right to exist in that space as a morally credible person.
Exactly. You feel unworthy of being heard.
And that's the paradox. How can something wrapped in virtue cause such deep harm? Our mission in this deep dive is to really understand this social mechanism.
And to identify the psychological weak spot it exploits.
Right. And most importantly, to turn to the great Stoic masters, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, who, honestly, they developed the ultimate strategies for internal resilience against this kind of thing.
It's fascinating because they were dealing with a very similar dynamic in ancient Rome. The use of public virtue as a weapon.
A cudgel.
A cudgel, yes. And their strategies weren't about winning the argument outside. They were about making sure that judgment didn't infect your inner life.
Okay, so let's unpack this. What happens when morality becomes the very weapon that shuts down dialogue before it even gets started?
The injury is, it's existential, not factual. Aurelius talked about injuries that come not from violence, but from judgments that are cleverly wrapped in morality.
So the person attacking you isn't saying your data is wrong.
No, they're implying your character is flawed and therefore nothing you say matters.
I think we've all been there. You ask a question about some social norm just to understand it better. You're genuinely curious.
And the immediate reply is what?
That is an insensitive question, or no conscientious person would think that.
And just like that, the argument has shifted. It's no longer about logic.
It's about character.
And Epictetus warns about this. Once that shift happens, you stop being a conversational partner. You become a problem to be fixed.
Right.
The moment someone believes they are standing on the high ground of moral certainty, they stop listening. They don't have to.
And the cost for the person who asked the question is just. It's huge. You immediately start to self-censor. You realize, if I keep talking, I'm not just risking being wrong.
You're risking being labeled bad.
Exactly.
And that's the dangerous leverage. Seneca warned about this. He said the most dangerous person isn't the wicked one, but the one who is utterly convinced they are doing good, without any self-questioning.
That certainty is what gives them permission.
It licenses the coercion. It lets them use shame as a tool to enforce conformity. It's a very subtle, very effective positioning of soft power.
So, if the effect is shame and retreat, what's the psychological vulnerability here? Why do our brains just panic in those first 30 seconds?
It's primal. When you hear insensitive or immature, your rational brain doesn't kick in right away and ask, is that true?
What does it ask?
The survival brain asks, am I still accepted? Am I about to be exiled?
It taps into the deepest human fear, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Epictetus believed our greatest fear isn't pain, but being cast out of the community. Moral bullying doesn't need to threaten you.
It just places you outside the boundary of good people.
And that activates a survival instinct. It pushes you toward compliance, almost unconsciously. Suddenly you're not arguing for truth anymore, you're arguing for acceptance.
Which makes sense why this often comes from a place of, well, collective insecurity, not just personal malice.
What do you mean?
If a group ties its whole identity to one specific moral standard, any question about that standard feels like a threat to the group's existence.
Not just a logical challenge to an idea. That's the fence metaphor. Morality should be a guide, a principle for how to act. But in this case, it becomes a fence to sort the insiders from the outsiders.
Aurelius noticed that people get angry not because their facts are rejected, but because their self-image is shaken.
The implied message is brutal. If you think differently, you do not belong with us.
And you see this play out constantly in the workplace. Someone questions a new policy, one that's presented as being for the common good.
Oh yes, or a reflection of our company values.
Right, and the immediate response is, if you question this, you must not care about the team.
That's the goal of the coercion. It forces you to defend your character, which is so much harder, so much more distracting than defending an opinion.
It's a total diversion.
Seneca saw it clearly. When morality is used to categorize people, to decide who's worth listening to, it becomes an instrument of power. The dialogue is no longer about truth. It's about control.
So let's talk about the mechanics of how this works today, where information just moves so fast. This kind of bullying, it doesn't need formal authority, does it?
No, not at all. It just needs quiet social consensus. A statement gets stripped of its context, slapped with a moral label like problematic, and that label spreads way faster than any logical argument ever could.
The sources outline 3 layers to this. The first is moralizing language.
Right. Words like conscious or civilized stop describing a behavior.
And start describing a person.
Exactly. If you label an idea uncivilized, you don't have to argue against it, you just dismiss it. It's outside the circle of acceptable thought.
And the second layer, collectivizing judgment, makes it feel like you're completely alone.
Yes. The language shifts from I disagree with you to
everyone knows this is wrong, or all right thinking people have moved on from this. It transforms your disagreement into a kind of social deviance.
and that triggers our deepest fear. And then there's a third layer, revoking dialogue status.
Once you're tagged as the problem, everything you say is just filtered through that lens.
Your words are no longer seen as an input to be considered. They're just more evidence of your moral failing. It's governance by shaming.
The silent toll of this, the invisible damage, it's enormous. You hear about people who live for months, even years, just constantly self-monitoring.
Passing every single thought through a filter. Will this make me seem morally wrong?
That's the existential impact.
It is. The soul, as Aurelia said, isn't damaged by big sudden blows. It's damaged by small, repeated retreats.
Every time you don't speak up, every time you change your words just to get accepted.
The self doesn't scream, it just thins out.
Yeah.
You start living 2 parallel lives. Seneca called this one of the greatest forms of self-betrayal.
The accepted life you show the world, and the real one you keep inside.
And that creates this deep exhaustion, this bitterness. You find yourself changing your vocabulary, not to be clear, but specifically to be less attacked.
And this is where the Stoics' insight is so powerful. The issue is no longer about whether your idea is right or wrong.
The issue is whether you allow the attackers to define your value.
They refuse to give up that authority.
Never. So let's get into the action plan. The Stoics didn't waste time trying to argue morality with people who had already weaponized it. They focused entirely on internal strategy.
So we're at that 10-second choice. Reaction or action? Reaction is getting pulled into their game, right? Wasting energy, proving you're a good person.
And action is staying focused on your own principles.
So strategy 1 from the toolkit, don't rush to self-justify.
This is a hard one. When you're labeled immoral or insensitive, your gut instinct is to panic and write a 5-paragraph essay explaining what you really meant.
We've all seen that email thread, the attack, and then the immediate emotional justification.
And Aurelius would say that every time you rush to prove your goodness, you have implicitly handed that other person the authority to judge you.
So what's the alternative?
Silence can be a form of power. It's a way of holding on to the right to define yourself. Instead of that reactive email, draft it, then delete it. The next morning, just ask a calm, clarifying question about the facts of the issue. You separate your character from the content and keep your composure.
I like that. Okay, strategy 2. Separate content from moral judgment. This is more direct. When someone says, a kind person wouldn't think that, how do you pivot without sounding defensive?
You pivot back to the facts, very neutrally. A response could be, my intent here isn't to discuss who's a good person or a bad person.
Okay.
It's to understand the practical impact of this proposal on our budget. Draw a boundary, you're saying? This conversation is about the issue, not my soul. You refuse the emotional bait.
Strategy 3 is tough for our culture, which is so built on being liked, except being misunderstood.
It's a brutal choice, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sacrifice your principles to be correctly understood or maintain your integrity and accept that you might be misunderstood.
Seneca said that not every disagreement is a betrayal.
That's it. The anxiety of being misunderstood is what drives us to over-explain and, frankly, to betray ourselves. The Stoic realizes you can't control how other people interpret you.
You just have to be willing to live with their verdict as long as your own internal compass is clear.
It takes real courage to choose integrity over public acceptance.
All right, what about strategy 4? This one can seem counterintuitive. Intentional retreat. Doesn't retreating just mean the bully wins? It feels like avoidance.
That's a crucial distinction. Epictetus taught that your freedom is not proven by standing and fighting in every single battle.
Okay.
Retreating isn't running away from conflict. It's choosing not to participate in a conversation that has already turned into a public judgment hearing. If it's not about truth anymore, but about control.
Then a retreat is actually a way of preserving your inner integrity.
Precisely. You're preserving your resources for fights that actually matter, where real dialogue is still possible. You're controlling your attention, which is the ultimate stoic resource.
You refuse to let that toxic energy occupy your mind. That makes sense. And finally, strategy 5, the biggest temptation of all. Do not become the counter-bully.
Oh, the impulse is always there, isn't it? To moralize right back. To call them hypocrites.
To point out all their moral failings.
That is the path of self-destruction. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself not to let others drag him down to a behavior he despised.
So even if you win the point, you've lost something bigger.
You've lost your inner composure, you've lost your integrity in the process of defending it. That's not a win.
So if we recap the Stoic victory here, they aren't promising a world without judgment.
No, that's impossible. They're promising a world where judgment loses its power over you.
The win isn't winning the argument, it's walking away without having become the person you were fighting against.
The true promised land, really, is that moment your inner value becomes completely detached from the moral judgment of other people. You stop asking, am I a bad person, every time someone disagrees with you.
Instead, you look inward. You ask different questions.
Was this action within my sphere of control? Did I betray my own principles?
And that shift is so liberating. It debunks the painful illusion that if you just live correctly enough, you won't be attacked.
Right. Morality doesn't protect you from moral bullying. Only inner integrity does. And sometimes that integrity comes with a certain loneliness. It's the cost of not belonging to every group or accepting every consensus.
A price the Stoics accepted willingly.
Because the alternative is living in constant fear of judgment, always twisting your actions and thoughts just to get permission to exist. They refuse to ask for that permission.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought, the one question that really defines whether you've mastered this internal defense.
If tomorrow you were suddenly no longer considered right or a good person by society, would you still have the courage to live according to what you believe is right within the sphere of your own control?
The Stoics seek not a world without judgment, but an inner self that judgment cannot occupy. And that truly is the final victory.